Stalingrad's deepest scars aren't the ones marking my skin. Istvan Kovacs is my name, son of Hungarian immigrants who sought refuge in Munich after the First World War. Fate has a peculiar sense of irony. It led me back to the same battlefields that haunted my father's nightmares during the most brutal winter I've ever faced. When I was called up in September 1942, I was only 20 years old. The initial pride of serving in the army soon turned into a bitter realization of the reality that awaited me. Our unit, the 6th Infantry Division, was assigned to the Eastern Front, specifically to what would become the bloodiest battle in history, Stalingrad. The first sight of the city already foreshadowed the hell we would face. The flames from the bombing dyed the sky red, and the smoke formed a dense curtain that obscured the sun. Our commander, Major Heinrich Weber, a veteran of the First World War, assembled our company before we entered the city. "Boys," he said, "forget everything you've learned about conventional warfare. Here, every building is a fortress. Every window can hide a sniper." Major Weber's words proved prophetic. In the very first days, we lost 3 men from our platoon in a single ambush. Hans, my best friend since basic training, was by my side when a Soviet sniper hit his helmet. The metallic sound of the ricocheting bullet saved his life, but the shock in his eyes has never left my memory. Our routine became an endless nightmare of urban combat. We quickly learned that mats were useless and the city was unrecognizable. We advanced meter by meter, building by building, in a deadly dance with an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain. The constant noise of artillery was mixed with shouts of order and the sound of machine gun fire. The cold, however, proved to be an even more implacable enemy than the Soviets. Our boots, designed for the European summer, were completely unsuitable for the Russian winter. Several comrades lost fingers to frostbite. Rations froze in our rucksacks, and we had to melt snow to drink water. One particularly freezing night, we took shelter in a partially destroyed building that had once been a school. We found children's drawings still nailed to the walls, a cruel reminder of the life that existed before the war turned Stalingrad into a concrete cemetery. Werner, our radio operator, managed to tune into a German broadcast, and it was the first time in weeks that we had heard news from the outside world. It was that night that I realized a fundamental change in our mission. We were no longer fighting for the glory of Germany or for grandiose ideals. We were fighting for survival. Every dawn was a victory, every meal a luxury, every moment of sleep a precious gift. Major Weber maintained our morale through small gestures of humanity. He shared his cigarettes, told stories of his youth, and, most importantly, treated each soldier as a human being, not just as a number. His leadership kept us together when everything around us was falling apart. The nights were the worst time. The occasional silence was more terrifying than the noise of the fighting. It was during these times that thoughts wandered home to the families we had left behind. Many of us kept photos of loved ones, some already faded and crumpled from holding them in moments of despair. The city was constantly changing around us. Buildings that served as landmarks disappeared under the power of artillery, creating a lunar landscape of destruction. We learned to read the subtle signs of danger, the sudden silence of the roads, the different shadows on the windows, the fresh footprints in the dirty snow. In the midst of the chaos, we formed bonds that transcended our own nationality. I remember a young soldier, Rudolf, who spoke fluent Russian because he had a grandmother from St. Petersburg. His language skills saved us several times, especially when we needed to negotiate a brief truce to collect the wounded. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, our perspective on the war changed completely. We were no longer the same young men who had marched confidently to the front. The cruel reality of Stalingrad transformed us into different men, marked by experiences that no human being should have to carry. This is just the introduction to my story in Stalingrad. There is much more to be told about those dark days, about the battles we fought not just against the enemy, but against ourselves, against the cold, against fear, and against human nature itself, which in times of war reveals its darkest sides and, surprisingly, also its noblest moments. As December approached, Stalingrad turned into a freezing nightmare. Temperatures plummeted well below zero, and our defensive positions became increasingly precarious. Major Weber warned us about the need to conserve ammunition. Supplies were running low, and the resupply convoys were finding it increasingly difficult to reach our positions. One particularly frosty morning, I was ordered to lead a reconnaissance mission with Hans and Werner. Our objective was to check out an apartment complex that the Soviets were possibly using as an observation post. The building, once an elegant residential building, was now nothing more than a bombed-out carcass, its windows as empty as the sockets of a skull. "Istvan," whispered Hans as we approached, "something is wrong here." His instinct was right. The silence was unnatural. Even the rats, which had become ubiquitous inhabitants of the ruins, seemed to have disappeared. Werner held his radio tightly, ready to call for support if necessary. We moved forward methodically, following the training that was now engraved in our bones. Every step was calculated, every move planned. The smell of gunpowder and death permeated the air, mixed with the acrid odor of burning wood. In the rubble, we found traces of the life that once inhabited that place. A scorched teddy bear, broken plates, a partially burnt family photograph. On the third floor, we discovered recent evidence of occupation. Soviet ammunition cartridges, leftover rations, cigarette but still fresh. Werner signaled that he had picked up movement in the building next door. Before we could react, the air was cut off by the familiar sound of rifle fire. We threw ourselves behind a collapsed wall, our hearts hammering against our chests. The ensuing exchange of fire was intense but brief. A Soviet grenade exploded near our position, raising a cloud of dust and debris. Werner was hit by shrapnel in the leg, but managed to keep his composure enough to radio for reinforcements. Hans provided cover while I dragged Werner to a safer position. The sound of approaching boots alerted us that they weren't German footsteps. With Werner wounded and our ammunition limited, I made a risky decision. Using my precarious Russian, learned from my father, I shouted a proposal for a temporary truce. To our surprise, a voice replied in heavily accented German, "We have a doctor. Do you have any wounded?" There followed a surreal moment in the midst of that brutal war. Under the nervous supervision of both sides, a Soviet doctor treated Werner's wound, while we provided some of our precious bandages for a wounded Russian soldier. Major Weber would later reprimand me for this decision, but he also admitted that sometimes humanity needs to prevail over orders. During that brief moment of peace, I observed the faces of the Soviet soldiers. They were young like us, exhausted like us, fighting and dying like us. One of them, who didn't look a day over 18, offered me a cigarette. I accepted, and for a few minutes we smoked in silence, united in our shared misery. That episode changed something in me. The war continued, brutal as ever, but I was beginning to see beyond the divisions imposed by propaganda. The enemy had a face, a name, and a story as valid as mine. This realization didn't make it any easier to pull the trigger when necessary, but it did weigh on my conscience every night. We returned to our main position with Werner being carried on a makeshift stretcher. Major Weber listened to our report with particular attention to the details of the Soviet positions we had observed. That information would be invaluable for planning our next moves, although we all knew that every day made our situation more precarious. In the evening, as I stood guard, I reflected on how Stalingrad was changing us. We were no longer the same men who had arrived months ago. The cold, hunger, and constant fear had stripped us of any illusions about the glory of war. Surviving until the next dawn became our only ambition. Hans joined me at the vigil, bringing a mug of thin coffee, a luxury we were still able to maintain thanks to the creativity of our field cook. "You know, Istvan," he said softly, "sometimes I wonder if anyone at home can imagine what it's like here." I didn't reply, but I understood perfectly what he meant. How can you explain Stalingrad to someone who hasn't lived through its horrors? January arrived with a ferocity that none of us were prepared for. The thermometer read -30 degrees, and our provisions were dwindling by the day. Major Weber had lost a considerable amount of weight, but he maintained his firm posture, refusing to show weakness in front of his men. One morning, during our routine patrol, Hans nudged me and pointed to a suspicious movement in a nearby building. It was a civilian family, a mother and two children trying to hide among the rubble. Against direct orders, we decided to help them. The woman was shaking uncontrollably, her blue hands holding her children tightly. My father always said that war reveals who we really are. I whispered to Hans as we shared our rations with the family. He was right. The woman told us, in broken Russian, that her husband was a university professor and had been killed in the first days of the battle. Her words, translated by Rudolf, weighed on our hearts like lead. Our unit was increasingly isolated. The Soviets had established strategic positions around us, and supplies were arriving less frequently. Werner, still recovering from his wound, started intercepting Russian communications, revealing that we were in an even more precarious situation than we had imagined. One particularly difficult night, we lost 5 men trying to defend our position in an abandoned factory. The sound of machine guns was mixed with cries of pain and distant explosions. Major Weber organized a tactical retreat, but the cost was high. Among the dead was Karl, our field medic, who had saved so many lives in recent weeks. The cold became increasingly bitter. We discovered that licking metal meant losing part of your tongue, that sleeping carelessly could result in death by frostbite, and that our weapons needed constant care not to jam. Some men began to show signs of frostbite on their feet and hands, but we kept fighting. In the midst of the chaos, we formed an unlikely friendship with a group of civilians taking refuge in the basement of an old bakery. They offered us information about Soviet movements in exchange for protection and some of our rations. A young woman called Nina, who spoke a little German, became our informal interpreter. "The Russians know every inch of this city," she explained to us one evening. "They use the sewers, the tunnels, every hole in the ground." Her words explained a lot about how the Soviets were able to appear and disappear like ghosts, surprising our apparently secure positions. Major Weber began meeting the officers more frequently. The maps on his desk showed an increasingly worrying reality. We were being methodically surrounded. Each day brought news of yet another German unit being forced to retreat or surrender. Our situation was a microcosm of what was happening throughout Stalingrad. Hans, always optimistic, tried to keep morale high by telling stories from his hometown in Bavaria. But even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes when he saw our ammunition reserves dwindling. Werner, for his part, spent hours trying to establish contact with Central Command, often without success. One afternoon during a patrol, we found a seriously wounded Soviet soldier. Against old military common sense, we decided to help him. Rudolf translated his slurred words. He was from Kiev. He had a pregnant wife waiting for him. While we were trying to staunch his wound, he showed us a crumpled photo of his family. He died minutes later, holding that same photograph. Major Weber didn't punish us for helping the enemy. Instead, he sat with us over dinner that night and shared a story from his own experience in the First World War. "Humanity," he said, "is the only thing we have left when everything else has been destroyed by war." As January progressed, our situation became more desperate. Soviet planes dominated the skies, making any attempt at aerial refueling practically impossible. At night, we could hear the Russian tanks moving around, further tightening the siege around us. The sound of their caterpillars on the ice became the soundtrack to our nightmares. The beginning of February brought a new dimension to our suffering in Stalingrad. Supplies had virtually ceased, and Major Weber was forced to have our rations. I noticed subtle changes in our faces, deeper eyes, hollower cheeks, increasingly distant expressions. Even Hans, with his unwavering optimism, was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. One morning, during our routine inspection, we discovered that 3 of our men had died in their sleep, not from gunshots or grenades, but from cold and exhaustion. Major Weber organized a brief funeral, the words of our prayer freezing in the air as we tried to dig through the ice-hardened soil. Rudolf translated the ceremony for Nina and the other civilians we had taken in, creating a surreal moment of unity between Germans and Russians. Werner, still limping from his previous injury, began to coordinate an improvised system of communication between the various points of our position using light signals, and simplified Morse code. It was vital to maintain some kind of contact, especially after we had lost 2 entire platoons to Soviet ambushes due to a lack of coordination. Our routine became a constant struggle not only against the enemy, but against our own deterioration. We had to move constantly to avoid freezing, but each movement cost precious energy that we could hardly afford to waste. Hans developed a system of exercises that we could do in confined spaces, a desperate attempt to keep our muscles working. One night, during my vigil, I witnessed something I will never forget. A group of Soviet civilians, including children, were trying to cross the no man's land between the battle lines. Major Weber ordered us not to shoot, and we watched in silence as they trudged through the snow. Some made it through, others, I'd rather not detail their fates. War has a cruel way of turning simple decisions into impossible moral dilemmas. Hunger became our closest companion. We started eating things we would never have considered before: leather from belts and boots, rats when we managed to catch them, anything that could provide some energy. Nina taught us to make a kind of soup with melted snow and small pieces of wallpaper, which contained a glue with some nutritional value. It tasted terrible, but it kept our stomachs occupied. Major Weber kept a meticulous diary of our losses and needs. One evening, I found him alone in his makeshift command post, studying those pages by the light of an almost finished candle. "Istvan," he said without raising his eyes, "do you think anyone will ever understand what happened here?" I had no answer to give. Hans and I had developed a particular code for communicating during patrols. 1 whistle meant immediate danger. 2 indicated a need to retreat. 3 were a request for reinforcements. This system saved us several times, especially when the Soviet snipers started to become bolder, taking advantage of our growing weakness. The days blended into an icy haze of sporadic fighting and long periods of tense waiting. Werner picked up rumors on the radio about major Soviet movements, but nothing that could give us any real hope of rescue. We began to accept that we were completely alone, forgotten by the high command amid the freezing chaos of Stalingrad. Nina and the other civilians became an integral part of our makeshift unit. They helped us maintain our humanity, reminding us that there was more to life than death and destruction. At night, when the cold became more intense, we would gather to share stories from home, creating a temporary bubble of normality in the midst of hell. Major Weber began to prepare contingency plans for our eventual surrender, although he never openly admitted it. Important documents were methodically burned, codes were changed, and specific instructions were given on how to proceed if we were captured. The reality of our situation became clearer with each passing day. Mid-February brought a different kind of silence to Stalingrad. It wasn't the tense silence that preceded an attack, nor the momentary stillness between artillery blasts. It was a silence of resignation, as heavy as the gray clouds that hung over us. Our situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of rescue or victory. Major Weber gathered the remaining officers in his makeshift bunker. His face, scarred by weeks of deprivation, revealed the gravity of our situation. "Gentlemen," he said in a hoarse voice, "we need to consider the reality of our position." The words didn't need to be said. We all knew the end was near. Hans, my faithful companion from the start, had lost so much weight that his uniform looked like it belonged to someone else. Still, he kept up his exercise routine, although now it was more an act of stubbornness than preservation. "If I'm going to surrender," he said, "at least I want to be able to walk to the Russians with my head held high." Werner continued to operate his radio, even when there was practically no communication left to intercept. The device had become a kind of symbol of our connection with the outside world, even if that connection was now only an illusion. The batteries were almost dead, and each transmission was rationed as if it were our last meal. Nina and the civilians we had protected began to prepare for our inevitable surrender. They taught us some basic Russian phrases not for tactical negotiations, but for basic human pleading. Water, medical, please. Words that could make the difference between life and death in the hours that followed. One evening, I found Major Weber burning personal documents and photos of his family. "I don't want them to have anything but my name in rake," he explained, without lifting his eyes from the flames. At that moment, I realized that even our commander, always so stoic, was preparing for the worst. The Soviets seemed to sense our weakness. Their attacks became less frequent, but more precise. They didn't waste ammunition, knowing that time was on their side. During patrols, we could hear their voices carrying orders and even the occasional song. The contrast with our silence was painful. Rudolf, our interpreter, began to have regular conversations with Nina about how the surrender would go. She described the procedures based on stories she had heard from other parts of the city that had already fallen. They separate officers from soldiers, she explained. And then her voice faded away, leaving the rest to our imagination. The cold was still relentless, but now it seemed secondary to our situation. We had learned to live with it, as one learns to live with a chronic illness. Our real concern was what awaited us beyond those ruins we had called home for the past few months. Hans found me one morning, holding his personal diary. "If I don't come back," he said, "I want you to give this to my family." I promised I would, even though we both knew it was a promise I probably couldn't keep. Still, there was comfort in that small act of hope. The days dragged on as we watched our situation deteriorate even further. Major Weber began to organize small groups for escape attempts, mainly the younger ones and those with the best chance of survival. Most didn't return, and the few who did brought stories that only confirmed our fears. On one of our last nights as a unit, we gathered in the basement that served as our refuge. Someone found a half-frozen bottle of vodka, and we shared that precious treasure while telling stories from home. For a few hours, we managed to forget where we were and what awaited us. Reality, however, could not be denied for long. Our ammunition was practically exhausted, medical supplies were non-existent, and the number of men able to fight was dwindling by the day. Major Weber set about preparing the necessary documentation for an orderly surrender, determined to maintain some dignity even in defeat. As I watched the sun rise over the ruins of Stalingrad, I reflected on how that city had changed us all. We were no longer the same men who had marched confidently months ago. The war had transformed us, stripped us of illusions, and shown us truths we would rather not have known. The surrender came on a particularly frosty February morning. Major Weber gathered us together one last time, his face marked by exhaustion and an awareness of the weight of that moment. "Men," he said, his normally firm voice now trembling, "you fought with honor. What happens from now on is beyond our control." Hans remained by my side as we organized our last possessions. We burned personal letters, destroyed sensitive documents, and shared the few remaining supplies with the civilians we had protected. Nina cried silently as she helped us with the translations of the Soviet instructions that were already beginning to echo through the speakers. "Istvan," Hans whispered as we waited for the final orders, "promise me you'll try to find my family if I survive." I nodded, knowing it was a promise I might never keep, but understanding the need to make that oath. Werner, still limping, destroyed his radio equipment with meticulous precision, ensuring that nothing of value fell in his Soviet hands. Major Weber organized our surrender with the same dignity with which he had commanded our resistance. We formed orderly lines, following his instructions until the last moment. I watched as he burned his last family photo before positioning himself at the head of our unit. His last act of leadership was to ensure that his men retained some dignity even in defeat. The Soviets appeared first as shadows among the ruins, then in ever-increasing numbers. Their faces showed a mixture of exhaustion and restrained triumph. Rudolf translated the orders we were receiving. Officers on the right, soldiers on the left. I saw Major Weber for the last time when he was separated from us, his posture still upright despite everything. Nina and the other civilians were the first to be taken away. She turned one last time, her eyes meeting mine with a silent message of gratitude and farewell. I never knew her fate again, but I often find myself thinking of her and the lessons of humanity she taught us during those dark months. The march into captivity was a surreal experience. We passed through places we had defended so hard, now unrecognizable under the snow and rubble. Every step was a farewell to Stalingrad, the city that had become our private hell and, paradoxically, our home. Hans walked next to me, muttering a prayer his mother had taught him as a child. Other soldiers were silent, each lost in their own thoughts and fears about the uncertain future that awaited us. The sound of our boots on the snow was the only music in that defeated procession. The Soviets led us through a corridor of ruins to a makeshift collection point. There, for the first time, I saw the true extent of our defeat. Hundreds of German soldiers, all in different states of physical deterioration, were awaiting their fate. The smell of defeat was more bitter than anything I had ever experienced. Werner was separated from us due to his unhealed wound. I tried to protest, but a stern look from a Soviet guard silenced me. Rudolf, our interpreter, was asked to help with the other prisoners, and so our little group fell apart, piece by piece. As we waited for the transport that would take us to captivity, I reflected on everything that Stalingrad had taught us. The war had no real winners, only different degrees of loss. We had arrived as conquerors and left as prisoners, but the most important thing was that we left changed, marked forever by that experience. Hans was the last to be separated from me. "See you soon, my friend," he said with a forced smile, before being taken to another group. Those were his last words to me. Years later, I found out that he didn't survive the long march to the prison camps in Siberia. Stalingrad remains in my memory not just as a lost battle, but as a testimony to the complexity of human nature. I saw cruelty and compassion, cowardice and courage, often in the same people. The city stripped us of our pretensions and showed us who we really were. I survived the prison camps and eventually returned home. But a part of me remained forever in those icy ruins, along with the comrades we lost and the lessons we learned. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a transformation of the soul, a testimony to the human cost of war, and an eternal reminder of our own mortality.